queer kid who's terrified. And so someone's asking where I was born. I was born in Lima, Peru. So I started finding these videos and going through them and then making photographs of my screen and then pulling them. And I became really interested in creating images that were somewhat confusing. I wanted images that kind of sat right between torture and pleasure. I wanted images that maybe looked a little playful, but maybe looked a little scary. And I wanted to put the viewer in a place where they didn't know if they were watching or like looking at pictures of a playful game, or if they were now complicit in witnessing torture, because I put them in that place. And it was really important to me to create that distinction. Images like this, I feel like you don't know if you're looking at, surveillance footage from Guantanamo, or if this are just a bunch of kids playing around. And I like that, that sort of in-between space.
Just one more image from the series that we have. And you were telling me originally these had been exhibited as prints, but you're looking into possibly another format. Do you want to talk a bit about that?
Yeah. So originally I showed them smaller. And this was partially because I had an opportunity to show these in an exhibition, and I had just made the work. And at the time, that kind of felt like the right format. I have actually a framed image here. This is kind of what they look like, and they're beautiful, and I really like how they turned out. They were very intimate, and at the time I was thinking about this sort of surveillance aesthetic and maybe them as being little screens, and I wanted people to get close. And over the last year and a half, I've been really rethinking that, and I've decided that these need to be very different. And if you can go back to the first image that we had, that kind of gives us a clue of what I'm going for. This is a mock-up of the installation that I'm working on right now, and they're going to be about 30 by 40 inches each, quite large, and they're going to be photogravures. So I'm working with a shop that is going to make copper plates of each one of these files, and then make a photogravure of them. And I'm really excited. I mean, photogravure, as you know, it's just so yummy. It has this gorgeous, beautiful surface. But at the same time, what I was interested in was that the image has a degradation. And originally, when I printed these digitally, I felt that, I mean, I knew that degradation was coming from a digital process. And in some cases, I even had to fake it. I had to like make the image smaller. And I wasn't totally happy with how that was looking. It felt a little bit forced. And the beauty of working with printmaking is that the process itself has its own way of breaking down the image, and the imperfections come from an organic printing process rather than sort of a more forced digital form. And I'm pretty excited. The idea is that one of the reasons I wanted them to be larger too is that because there's so much about the body, and this motion of the body is so important. I wanted viewers to be able to relate their own mass, their own body, to what they're looking at. And I find that when you're looking at figurative work that's small, it's a little bit more difficult to put yourself in that picture or in that image. And by making them larger, I feel like the violence and the motion will be felt in a different way.
Yeah, I was thinking as you were talking also that idea of surveillance changes a bit with the smaller image. It seems a bit more removed, that the viewer is looking at something that they're not actually physically witnessing. But at this scale, it makes the viewer probably feel more involved as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I see Senia, who's a curator I've worked with before and actually exhibiting this work. And she says still they have a screen effect, and I think that's totally true. They still kind of read as screens in a way. Yeah.
And so there's one more body of work that we were going to talk about, so we can move on to that and then take some more questions.
Sure.
Speaking of scale.
Yeah, exactly. So this is new work that is currently in production. This is video work that I shot in Lima, in Peru last April. And they are currently, the video is almost finished, but we're doing the sound post-production, the sound design at the moment. And unfortunately, COVID sort of has pushed everything a little bit. And we were supposed to be in Peru right about now. I had a show opening of Imagine Futures in Lima in April that was supposed to coincide with Art Lima, with the art fair, and then we were launching the book there as well. So we had to cancel all of that, and at the same time, I was supposed to film the second and third chapter of this video piece. So all of that has been pushed out. But this particular video, I'm going to call it a video vignette, because I think eventually I would love for these different vignettes to be part of a larger work. It's called Marcha, which means march. And the full title is Marcha, Izquierda, Derecha, Izquierda, left, right, left. And it comes from a memory of going to school and growing up in an all-boys Catholic school. It wasn't a military school, but we did have to march every July for the Peruvian independence. And it was an activity that I never really understood why we had to do it. And it was also an activity that I didn't really enjoy. But it was something that most of the boys really liked because it had this, military quality to it. And it was a boys thing. And I just didn't like standing outside and having someone tell me, what to do and how to move my body and all of this. And so it's one of my earliest memories of, maybe not one of my earliest, but it's a strong memory that I have of someone telling me how to perform masculinity and how to be a man in a way. So I was really interested in maybe bringing back this visual reference of the marching. I also, my father was in the Navy, in the military, so there is some sort of military elements in my upbringing in terms of just not so much in the home, but in my context and what I was thinking, what I was seeing. And when we marched, 3 boys were always chosen to kind of lead the march, and there were oftentimes the tallest ones, the ones with the better form, and there was also some kind of again, masculine sort of stamp of approval if you were one of those. But to me now, when I look back, this whole thing is very campy, and there's a very it's just very campy. It's very costumey. It's very gay, very queer. You have you're all performing. You're wearing these ribbons, and you have usually they had these phallic batons that they're waving around. And so I was really interested in looking back and thinking about what defines masculinity and why, and asking these boys to perform these like military parades, and for what reason, what was the point? I should note that it was very common in Lima, in all of Peru, that women would march as well. So this is not just a boys thing, but for me growing up in a boys school, this became something that I remember very clearly. So we filmed 3 boys marching in place in front of the camera. And I was really interested in, almost like the past work, in finding moments in which the boys look like men and finding moments in which the boys look like boys. And so when you're sort of far away, you see this young men marching in place, and you think, oh, maybe they're young cadets or something like that. But then when the camera gets very close, you can tell that their eyes are shifting, like they're not very secure in themselves, and they got little pimples, and they're sweating, and there's a self-consciousness to their face and how they're acting. And I was really interested in creating that middle ground. There's also, with the sound will be really important. And there's moments in the video where you're standing in the middle of the room and you hear them marching in a very thunderous fashion. It's very loud and it's very commanding, and it sort of demands a presence. And then there's moments where it's very, very quiet and you can just hear them breathe. And it's almost sensual. And I wanted to create that space where the viewer maybe feels a little bit uncomfortable, because if these are men, then that might be fine. But if they're young boys, to be standing in a room where you're hearing them breathe in your ear, then that's a little inappropriate. So I wanted to find different ways to make the viewer decide for themselves as to whether these are boys or men. So that's kind of the first installment of these video pieces, vignettes, that look at the construction of masculinity from a Latinx perspective in Latinx culture, by taking these memories and these sort of moments in time and bringing them into a black box theater and stripping them of their context to sort of reveal the absurd nature of them.
And I can play the video without sound. I will just have to turn my camera, if that's all right. We can talk a little more about it. Let's see.
Great. So yeah, as you can see, it's a 3-channel video. So not all screens are on at the same time. And there are also some prolonged moments of blackness, or where you may not see something, but during those moments, you're actually hearing something. So there may be moments where all screens are black, but you're hearing them, the boys breathe or march or shifting place. And then there's moments where you see and hear the same thing. And the screens sort of dance around, so you're constantly shifting from one to another.
How did you cast this?
I worked with the young boy you see on the right now with the curls. Mm-hmm. He actually went to the school I went to, and I met him. I have a friend who I went to school with who does theater, and he connected me to the theater department at our school currently. And they put me in touch with this boy, and he recruited some of his friends to be part of this. But some of the videos that we're doing moving forward have about 12 different boys, and we're using a combination of finding some of their friends and using a casting person who helps us find people. When the crew gets larger, we kind of have to start using professionals to help, but not professional actors, but professional casting people, castineras, what they call them, and production folks to just kind of help us keep everything in track. I wish they could be a little younger, but for logistical reasons, I'm working with kids who are 18, and many of whom look younger. It's just a lot harder to work with minors, and especially when you're working with these subjects, being able to convince their parents to sign permissions and all of that. Also, some of the upcoming videos will have not violence necessarily, but some physical elements that are just a little bit easier to coordinate with boys who are 18 already.
Well, thank you for sharing that with us. It's kind of fun to see something that's still in progress.
Yeah.
And before we get to questions, if anyone watching has any, I know we also want to talk about your curatorial practice. And something we've been saying throughout this series is we're working with a lot of contemporary artists who also do curatorial work in different ways, whether it's really tied to their practice or not. And you are a co-founder of Strange Fire Collective, which is a really interesting project that you can tell us more about.
Yeah. So Strange Fire Collective was founded in 2015 by Zora Murph, Hamida Glasgow, Jess Dugan, and myself. And we are a group of artists and curators. We're all sort of people who've always had our hands in many different pots. And we decided at the time that we weren't finding what we needed in the art world for ourselves. We weren't finding platforms and resources and spaces that, highlighted work by people who looked like us, who spoke like us. We weren't finding archives and resources where we could find artists of color, where we could find women, queer people. So we created Strange Fire Collective, and it's a platform that supports and highlights work by women, people of color, and queer and trans artists, writers, and curators. And we, at the very beginning, we started we started doing one thing because we wanted to be very realistic with our time and what we could do, and not just imagining a bunch of things and then not pull through with them. So we decided that we would post one interview, like one in-depth conversation or interview every month, every week of every month of the year. So there's 4 of us, we each take on 1 week. And so we each do 1 interview a month. So I do 12 per year, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it's actually a ton of work. And
it is, yeah.
Yeah. And so up until now, we have over 235 interviews. Over the last 4.5 years, I think we've barely missed any Thursday. We post every Thursday. And, without fail, we try to make that deadline and just bring you conversations and like in-depth interviews and looks at artists and curators and writers that align with that mission. We wanted to create an archive and something that teachers could use. We were tired of hearing curators and teachers tell us like, oh, well, I didn't include any women in the show because there aren't any, or I couldn't find any. And I'm like, well, you didn't look hard enough, one. And we didn't want that to be an excuse anymore. We wanted to be able to say, well, if you go here, here's at least 235 by now, but there's like 10,000 more. So, we've really taken that task to heart, and we are we're very committed to it. And over the years, it has grown. So we also now curate about 1 brick and mortar exhibition every year. We create a publication that goes along with every exhibition. And recently, we started doing book reviews, primarily photography and art book reviews. We've also starting to expand a little bit. We were very photo focused at first because all of us have a photography background, but each of us actually has a slightly different interest, which is great. But I know for me, I've been really trying to interview non-photographers just to diversify our roster a little bit. I know that Jess is really interested in interviewing curators and people who work with institutions. So there's really just kind of a nice range of topics that we cover. And that's about, the gist of it. We had in just this past October, it was our 4th year anniversary, and we did our largest exhibition yet at the Milwaukee Institute of Art and Design. And we did it was called In This Body of Mine. And we also did a pretty big panel discussion and talk that traced some sort of through lines through the artists that we that we represent in the website. And it's really just taken us to a lot of cool places. For me, it's become a great excuse to have conversations with people I really admire. So being able to write to someone I don't know and say, hey, can I interview you for this, has actually become a part of my practice.
Yeah, and how does that actually inform your work? I'm curious.
Yeah, I don't know that I can tell you like a very concrete way,
yeah.
but I really do think that it informs how I think about my work, because I'm seeking now. I think at first I interviewed a lot of the people I knew, the people who were in my circle, and now I'm seeking artists whose work challenges me, whose work I find really interesting, and I think having those conversations with them and curators too is helping me kind of think, tap into different ways in which artists are thinking and solving problems, and then I'm taking little bits of that with me and thinking about that. I also, let me grab this book here, because we do, I mentioned we produce a catalog with each exhibition, and this is what we did for our last exhibition in this body of mine. And I do all the design for the collective. So we had a really great little catalog with information on all the artists and, installation shots, and a great essay that Hamida and Zora wrote. So it's pretty fun. It feeds a lot of my my interests and my passions in different ways. I love making art, but I'm a slow maker, and I do have a second degree in curatorial studies, and I've always loved. I'm like that weird guy who loves doing admin work. Like, I love writing, and I've been doing some book reviews now on this side as well, and to be able to sit with another artist and spend a day or two just thinking about their work and then writing a thoughtful, in-depth review of their book. It's also helping me hone in my writing skills. So it really, when I'm not making art, it keeps me busy doing other things, interviewing, writing, designing, posting, sharing, lifting other people's work. It just makes me really happy,
Yeah, and I mean, it's definitely a really important project to be working on. So we have about 10 minutes left. If anybody who's watching has any questions, feel free to jump into the comments section. One question I have for you, in the meantime, is aside from your colleagues and these artists who you're interviewing, who your references are for your work. One kind of funny coincidence I asked you when we were preparing is if you knew the work of Eric Meyenberg, who had an American Society exhibition a few years ago, and kind of similarly deals with issues of masculinity and different layers of Latin American history, but in Mexico with that kind of marching choreography. It's different. You're doing definitely very different things. But I'm curious who you do have in mind.
Yeah. And I love that reference, because I love finding artists whose work aligns really, really well with yours, but you had never met them or heard of them before, because I think I'm of the opinion that everything has been done before, and that we all just work in these kind of loop systems, and that my experience is not necessarily always entirely unique, that there are people who are experiencing the things I'm experiencing somewhere else, and how they're solving those problems, I think, are really interesting. And in terms of my influences, I have quite a few kind of wide-ranging influences. I love the work of Carlos Mota, whom I think you guys have worked with before. I've always really admired how he takes on issues of social issues and queerness and Latinidad, and then introducing them in different ways. I've always been a huge fan of Louise Bourgeois. I love how she can take these very, very dark subjects and present them in ways that are almost comforting, or the other way around, taking things that are very comforting and presenting them in ways that are very uncomfortable. So I really appreciate that. I'm a huge fan of Sophie Calle. Just love how she uses narrative and how it's funny, she's always been considered like a photographer, but she's not really. She uses pictures and she uses images in really interesting ways, and how she incorporates performance with archives, with social experiments and things like that. I'm really, really attracted by her work. I'm really inspired by the work of Sergio Ceballos and El Grupo Chaclacayo, which is something that Miguel Lopez wrote about, and that's how I discovered the work at El Museo de Arte de Lima. I saw it for the first time in Lima at the museum, and it's this amazing group of young dissident artists in Lima who were escaping the city and escaping the elite to make a home for themselves in the countryside and create these kind of gender-bending rituals that challenged what was going on socially. There was so much death in the country at the hands of both the government and the Shining Path, with this civil war going on with terrorism, and so many people died. And I think it's very relevant with what's going on right now with the pandemic, how they took the image of death and said, this is important. We have to look at it. It's happening right now. So I have, a really kind of wide range of influences.
That's great. Speaking of Peru, the show you were about to have there was going to be Imagine Futures, right?
Correct. Yes.
So I'm curious how you think about that work, returning to the Peruvian context or for that audience.
Yeah, that's a good question. I actually was really nervous. I've exhibited in Peru just a little bit in some group shows. I have never had a solo show, and I've never had to openly speak about my work there. And I was a little bit nervous about it, but I was really kind of welcoming the challenge. Just because I think there's a little bit of a stigma when people leave a country and then they make work about it somewhere else and then they come back to it to present it. I know there's sometimes an attitude of like, well, why did you leave? Like, why didn't you just stay here? But it's complicated. And I think I would have a better answer for you if I had been able to do it and known, but I can tell you that that there was a lot of anxiety for me about that, and that I was really curious as to how it was going to play out and what people were going to think, or if people would even be able to relate to the work if they're not immigrants themselves. So yeah, I was excited about the show as well, because I think it was going to answer a lot of questions for me, and maybe give me new ways of thinking about that.
Well, thank you again. If we don't have any other questions, we can wrap it up before we're cut off. Hopefully we will be able to see that work